I'm one of these people that's got their fingers in a lot of different things. So that's both good and bad, and that I see across a lot of different disciplines and stuff. But there's a lot going on at a given time. So yeah, I thought it covered the bases pretty well.
Great. Dave, why don't you dive in? So it's just gone 36 there. If you can run for just a smidge under 20 minutes, if
Sure.
possible, to keep us on time.
Yep.
Welcome.
Yeah, glad to be here, Richard. Thank you very much for the great introduction. Are you able to see that presentation properly?
Looks good to me, yeah.
Okay, great. So again, my name's Dave Troy, and as Richard said, I'm the CEO of a company called 410 Labs based in Baltimore, Maryland. And I have been for the last 4 years or so really focused on a lot of information regarding or research involving misinformation and disinformation. So just to be really clear for the purposes of this talk, misinformation is false information that is not necessarily intended to cause harm. This might be like medical misinformation telling you that you can cure yourself of COVID by gargling bleach or whatever the lie of the day is. This kind of stuff is not often produced with an intent to harm, but is often just kind of floating out in the wild, sometimes with the intent of making money. And then disinformation is information that was created and promoted with the intention of causing harm. So this idea of intent is kind of key to understanding this field. So what kind of things are we talking about? You know, you probably heard that back in 2016, 2015 timeframe, the United States was targeted with a major disinformation attack. And this has been happening throughout the world in various kinds of capacities. Some of it, you know, coming from state sponsors like Russia and China and Iran, North Korea. But there's a lot of different flavors of it out in the world. And what I want to try to convey to you today, if you know, there's just one thing that you take away from it, is sort of what is the nature of this problem, and how do we, you know, have some chance of attacking and fixing this problem, and you know, towards that end, how might we be able to use AI as part of that process? So just to give you some sense of the backdrop of, you know, kind of what's going on in say the United States right now. Around 20% of people approve of political violence, and 25% of people approve of splitting the country in two. This was as of November 2019, and that has gotten, I would say, significantly worse now. And so what is this process that disinformation is acting on that is causing us to become so divided? And to help us understand that, I want to talk briefly about the idea of cults. So with cults, you may recognize some of these images as being familiar to you from sort of the idea of cults. On the left is Jim Jones of the People's Temple, who notoriously led 900 folks to their death in Guyana, South America, back in 1978. And then on the upper right is a still from the movie The Godfather, which you know. And if you think about what a mafia is, it is a certain kind of a cult. It is a, you know, social network that has a great deal of internal social capital, and where the rules of the group outweigh the societal concerns that the rest of us have. Likewise, on the lower right here is an image from the Salem witch trials in the United States in 1692. And this was a case of group conflict where, you know, one group had more social capital than, or had a tightly wound amount of social capital and was pitted against another group. And they got into this giant conflict where they were burning people at the stake, et cetera. So if you think about a cult as a network and you look at it from a network science point of view, this is what a cult might look like, where you've got this very tightly knit, you know, let's say fully meshed social network, which isn't realistic, but, you know, this is an illustration, with a leader, and everybody in the network has a relationship with the leader. And these folks are sort of steeled against the world because of this very tight social relationship between them. But the real world, normal society, a healthy society might look more something like this, where each member is a part of their own little subgroup, but they have a lot of messy connections to other people that aren't like them. And there's a lot of sort of what people in the sociology field call cross-cutting social connections that help to balance people's points of view and keep them from becoming so extreme. So, you know, the process of adding disinformation into these kinds of networks tends to have this kind of an effect, where things become more and more homogenized and sorted into, you know, sort of these tightly knit groups, and they become, you know, more and more wedded to the points of view that are popular within those subgroups. So you can see some of this happening within the political realm all around the world. It's not unique to the United States. It's happening in Europe, and you saw it in the Brexit vote to some extent, where people were people in rural areas were interested in Brexit. People in urban areas were not. And ultimately, if you let this process kind of advance to its end state, you get a configuration that might look something like this, where people are fully blown apart into these separate networks and unable to bridge any of their divides. And obviously, this is an extreme example. You're never going to get to that stage. But the point is to illustrate the notion that this process can keep driving you in that general direction. So if you study cults, one of the things that you find in that realm is that you can kind of define cults by what kind of properties characterize that network. So you can see on this continuum here, this is put together by a friend of mine named Steve Hassan, who's the leading expert on cults in the world. Being able to have like real relationships, and have your own conscience and creativity and things like that, that is healthy. And that's the kind of thing you find in a non-cult configuration. On the right, you see that you have, this idea of cult identity and people being narcissistic and, going after hot doctrine and hating each other and elitism, some of these other properties here. That's more characteristic of this cult network configuration. So the thing that's kind of challenging in the prospect of, this kind of a process happening within a democracy is that individuals kind of go around telling themselves that they have agency and free will and that they are the ones that are making rational decisions with respect to democracy and democratic rule and all of that. When in fact, it's actually kind of possible to program society into these kind of fairly predictable kind of patterns and to elicit reactions from them using tools like disinformation. So, this process of getting people into these divided cliques is really radicalization. And we, typically think of that in terms of terrorists and stuff like that. But if you think about it just merely as a social and network phenomenon, it really is defined by the idea that when the in-group values for that small clique override societal values, and you decide instead to make decisions that favor your in-group versus the ones that might benefit society as a whole. So that's really what disinformation does. It divides us into these in-groups and out-groups. It hardens the boundaries between groups. It creates excess social capital, unhealthy social capital within these groups, and it can cause cognitive errors in group decision making. And by that, what I would say is, suppose, for instance, that your in-group values are that climate doesn't matter, and in fact, probably climate matters. You're going to be making mistakes about how you evaluate the world. And so this whole process, tends to turn what we think of as truth into a political position. There is no absolute truth. There's only relative, beliefs within the context of these groups. So what kinds of things are companies doing, to try to counter this? And, if you think about the kind of vectors that we have where this kind of thing is being, driven, it's social media. So companies like Facebook, right now have done not as much as they should. They are, as of a few weeks ago, not willing to take a stance on various kinds of political speech. And that while they have done, a fair amount to try to mark, advertising as being paid for by political sources and, politicians and foreigners and that kind of thing, I think there's widespread agreement that there's a lot more that Facebook could and probably should do. Twitter is maybe doing a little bit more by starting to be a little bit more aggressive about labeling certain kinds of things as false. But I think in general, we need to be thinking about how tech companies approach, the ethics of the designs of these platforms. If you think about, kind of like what's happening to us societally, there is an ethical aspect to the design of, say, computing platforms. So like the fact that you have a computing platform by itself doesn't really impose very much in the way of behaviors on top of that. It's sort of really an application layer concern that when you get into behaviors. So there's kind of at each layer of this, of the, sort of computing and networking and tech stack, there is, other kinds of things that get layered on top of that from a design standpoint that actually drive behavior. So the most extreme example that you might think of in that regard is, what kind of person does Instagram create? What kind of society does one made up of Instagram users create? What is that like? And so if you think about the kinds of behaviors that something like Instagram promotes, which is to take photos that look good but maybe are a little bit staged, or promoting consumerism, or a certain look, or that kind of thing, are those things good for society? So I think that's something that the tech world needs to be thinking about, especially as we start to layer AIs on top of things that promote certain kinds of behavior. That's a very key consideration. So then you layer on top of this the coronavirus infodemic, or coronavirus epidemic, and some people say that that's caused an infodemic of disinformation. And oftentimes with any kind of crisis, there's a wave of disinformation that will follow that. And this crisis has been no different. We've seen, this is some very early coronavirus disinformation from back in March. It's very sort of predictable that you're going to have people trying to layer this on top of political divides, because the pandemic itself has tended to, have prevalence as a function of population density, which is one of the divides that disinformation itself has been layered on. I think that in terms of good responses to sort of dealing with the information side of this, Audrey Tang in Taiwan has done a really great job of kind of rethinking this problem from the ground up. And if you don't know about Audrey Tang, she is an amazing person, digital minister in Taiwan. And what they've really tried to do is to, instead of allowing information to sort of divide people, they've worked really hard to create information that brings people together by using things like humor. So they call it humor over rumor. And when they do use humor, it's always like self-deprecating humor and like fun, zany kind of stuff, rather than trying to belittle, people that don't believe and that kind of thing. And that has been a very different kind of an approach from what we've seen in the United States, and is a much healthier counter to, kind of an information environment handling approach than what we've done. So, the goal for dealing with this whole COVID situation should be really to just maximize total health. We've gotten all kind of wound up about masks or no masks and everything else. And, there are all key aspects there that need to be managed. But in terms of creating an information environment, we need to create an information environment that allows people to accurately assess reality, avoid political framings, and we need to be able to defend against both disinformation and misinformation. So in terms of what's coming next in 2020, what's left of it, we've seen some disturbing new trends. The Kremlin's disinformation playbook, their idea of kind of using divisive content and rumors and all kinds of made up fake news type stuff has been adopted by China to some extent, and we're starting to see some overlap between China and Russia's sharing of specific narratives, and that's worth keeping an eye on. Twitter has worked to take down a whole bunch of China-linked accounts spreading disinformation on both Hong Kong and coronavirus. That was just 2 weeks ago. And then, of course, going into the rest of the year, we've got to deal with all kinds of issues with deep fakes. You might have seen there's a project called Avatarify that lets you create, Elon Musk for your Zoom calls, and presumably other folks as well. And then, of course, we've got this emerging, generative adversarial networks being able to produce, very believable looking faces, which is leading to people creating avatars for accounts. This is, this beautiful woman does not exist. You can go to thispersondoesnotexist.com to generate people for your fake avatars. In terms of disinformation that we're seeing right this second, this is from this morning. We're seeing this huge disinformation campaign around promoting division around face masks, especially in the States. And then also we've got this Boogaloo thing, which is sort of an emerging movement towards having a civil war in the United States. Although it's unclear exactly how violent it might be. It's a little bit more notional than violent at this point, but it could get worse pretty quickly. In terms of what else we're expecting in the United States this year, we're expecting election disruption in the form of both disinformation and deep fakes. Various kinds of information noise. There's a Russian term for this, infoshum, which is basically putting out a ton of information, basically really silly news stories that overwhelm your ability to evaluate what is actual real news and content. There's been a lot of talk about potential attacks on power infrastructure and other kinds of critical infrastructure email bombs, like, sending people 10,000 emails so that they can't find real stuff in their email, phishing, hack and dump attacks, and specifically attacks on election infrastructure, and then also to sow doubts about the process within the population. So where might AI be able to help in this? The truth is, with disinformation, outside of the main platforms that are trying to use AI to detect some of these operations early on, it's very difficult for sort of outsiders to use AI much yet. And what we are mostly focused on within the disinformation research community right now is building kind of frameworks and infrastructure to be able to spot this stuff as it's sort of emerging out in the wild, and then be able to add metadata to it and document it so that we can then potentially interface with platforms to help them take down stuff and otherwise act on things before they become a problem. Part of the issue you might have seen with this pandemic video that was floating around a few weeks ago is that it can go from 0 to completely global in just a matter of a couple of days, and it's very difficult to put it back in the can once that happens. So getting a hook into the process sooner is key. And just like we talked about with using potentially AI to detect, the emergence of pandemic and COVID-like situations, we can also use AI to detect the spread of potentially harmful information, as well as inauthentic actors and things like that. So I think, there's a list of things I've put here that, potentially we could be using AI to do more of, but the fact of the matter is that we're still very much on the human, sort of side of this, building out human processes and we ultimately can help to automate. So if you're interested in getting involved in this community, this is one very good on-ramp called CogSec Collab and CogSec Collaborative. And, this is a group of people that basically is helping to build a framework to detect disinformation attacks, what they call left of the boom, and the boom being, when there's a problem that you can detect in society. And we're borrowing a lot of the same ideas from kind of the cyber kill chain world for this, and but it's really about cognitive security. It's about protecting what goes on in people's minds, and we can definitely use help from the AI side to help drive that. So just to wrap up, I think this is the classic blue marble image. It's very important that we keep our eyes on the planet as a whole, and our shared collective goals as humans. If we get sidetracked with weird cultish behavior within the context of our individual societies, and we're unable to act in concert together on things that actually matter, we are at severe risk as a planet. So on this last slide, I didn't want to let it go to waste. There's some really interesting books that you might find interesting on this broad set of topics, and I'd be happy to follow up with you on any of these topics, both now and later on. So again, thank you for having me, and happy to answer any other questions you might have.